The mare lay dying in the tall grass, her leg crushed in a rusted steel trap, and a grotesque swelling pulsing on her fractured skull, while her 3-month-old foal refused to abandon her broken body. What that tiny creature did in the hours that followed left the entire rescue team in stunned silence and changed everything they believed possible. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun had just begun to paint the Kentucky hills in shades of amber and gold when Clara Henderson stepped onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand, ready to begin another day at Willow Creek Farm. For 32 years, she had dedicated her life to rescuing horses that others had given up on, turning her modest property into a sanctuary where broken spirits could heal and forgotten souls could find love again. At 63 years old, Clara had seen more suffering than most could imagine, yet her heart remained as tender as the day she had rescued her very first horse, a starving stallion named Thunder, who had lived out his final years in peaceful contentment on her land. That particular Tuesday seemed ordinary enough. The roosters had crowed their morning chorus, the barn cats had emerged from their hay bale hideouts to stretch in the early light, and the distant sound of tractors hummed across the neighboring farms. Clara took a long sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest, when suddenly her phone rang with an urgency that made her stomach tighten. The caller was Marcus Webb, a local farmer who lived about 7 miles down the old county road, and his voice trembled with a mixture of panic and desperation that Clara had learned to recognize over the years. Marcus explained that while checking his fence lines along the property boundary that morning, he had stumbled upon something that had stolen the breath from his lungs. There, in a patch of overgrown grass near the old logging road, lay a chestnut mare in obvious distress. Her front leg was caught in a rusted steel jaw trap, the kind that had been illegal for decades but still turned up occasionally in these forgotten corners of the countryside. But the trap was not the only horror that Marcus had witnessed. The mare had a grotesque swelling on her forehead, a bulging mass that suggested something far more sinister than a simple injury, and standing beside her, trembling and confused, was a young foal who refused to leave its mother's side despite the danger and chaos surrounding them. Clara did not hesitate for even a moment. She grabbed her emergency kit from the mudroom, shouted for her farmhand Diego to bring the trailer around, and within 15 minutes they were racing down the winding roads toward the location Marcus had described. Her mind churned with possibilities and fears as the truck bounced over potholes and gravel patches. Steel jaw traps were vicious devices designed to clamp down with enough force to shatter bone, and the longer the mare remained caught, the greater the risk of permanent damage or infection. But it was the swelling that worried Clara most of all, for she had seen similar presentations before in horses who had suffered traumatic brain injuries, and she knew that time was not on their side. When they arrived at the scene, Clara felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. The mare lay on her side in the tall grass, her breathing labored and shallow, her beautiful chestnut coat matted with sweat and dirt. The trap had clamped around her right front leg just above the hoof, and the wound it had created was raw and weeping with blood that stained the grass around her in dark crimson patches. The swelling on her head was even more alarming up close, a dome-shaped protrusion above her left eye that pulsed slightly with each heartbeat, indicating that pressure was building inside her skull. But what brought tears to Clara's eyes was the foal, a tiny creature no more than 3 months old, who stood guard over its mother with a fierce determination that defied its tender age. The foal watched Clara approach with wide, frightened eyes, but it did not run. Instead, it positioned itself between its mother and the approaching humans, its small body quivering with fear yet standing firm. Clara had never seen such courage in one so young, and she knew in that moment that she was witnessing something extraordinary. This foal would not abandon its mother, not even when every instinct should have told it to flee from the strange people and their loud vehicles. Marcus stood nearby, his weathered face pale with worry. He explained that he had tried to approach the mare to help her, but every time he got close, she would thrash and struggle, causing the trap to bite deeper into her flesh. The foal had even kicked at him once, a warning that clearly communicated its willingness to defend its mother at any cost. Clara nodded, understanding the situation immediately. These horses had been through something terrible, and they had learned not to trust humans, which meant that gaining their confidence would be essential before any rescue attempt could succeed. Clara knelt in the grass about 10 feet from the mare and began speaking in soft, gentle tones. She did not move closer or make any sudden gestures. Instead, she simply talked, letting her voice carry across the distance like a warm blanket of reassurance. She spoke of peaceful meadows and fresh water, of sunny days and safe shelters, of a world where no harm would ever come to them again. The mare's ears flickered toward her, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, her breathing seemed to slow just slightly. The foal, too, appeared to relax a fraction, though it maintained its protective stance with unwavering vigilance. Diego had already called the veterinary emergency team, and within 30 minutes Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived with her mobile clinic van. Sarah was one of the best equine veterinarians in the state, a woman whose skill and compassion had saved countless animals over her 20-year career. She took one look at the mare's head and her expression grew grave. She suspected a brain hemorrhage, likely caused by severe trauma, and she knew that without immediate intervention the mare would almost certainly die. But first they had to free her from the trap without causing further injury, and they had to do it while earning the trust of a protective foal who saw every human as a potential threat. The rescue that followed would test everyone present to their absolute limits. It would require patience, skill, courage, and above all, a deep well of love for creatures who could not speak for themselves. What none of them knew yet was that this mare and her foal would change their lives forever, and that the bond between mother and child would prove stronger than any trap, any injury, or any obstacle that fate could place in their path. The shocking turn that awaited them would leave the entire community speechless and remind them all of the extraordinary power of devotion. Dr. Sarah Mitchell assessed the situation with the calm precision that came from years of handling emergencies in the field. She could see that the mare was deteriorating rapidly, her body weakened by blood loss and the pressure building inside her skull. The swelling on her forehead had grown noticeably larger, even in the short time since Clara had arrived, and Sarah knew that every minute they delayed could mean the difference between life and death. But rushing in blindly would only make things worse, for the mare was still capable of thrashing violently, and the foal remained positioned as a living shield between its mother and anyone who dared approach. Sarah turned to Clara with a look that conveyed both urgency and determination. They would need to sedate the mare before attempting to remove the trap, but administering the injection would require getting close enough to find a vein, which seemed impossible given the circumstances. Clara suggested an alternative approach that she had used once before with a particularly traumatized rescue. She would continue talking to the mare while slowly moving closer, using her voice and body language to establish trust, while Diego circled around from the opposite side to distract the foal just long enough for Sarah to administer the sedative. The plan was risky, but they had no other options. Clara began her slow approach, keeping her movements fluid and non-threatening. She sang softly, an old lullaby that her grandmother had taught her decades ago, and the melody seemed to carry across the morning air like a gentle breeze. The mare's ears rotated toward her, following the sound, and her wild eyes began to soften just slightly. The foal watched Clara with intense suspicion, but it did not move from its position, as if torn between fleeing and staying to protect its mother. Meanwhile, Diego had retrieved a bucket of sweet feed from the trailer and was approaching from the eastern side, making soft clicking sounds with his tongue that horses often found soothing. The foal turned its head toward him, nostrils flaring to catch the scent of the grain, and for just a moment its attention wavered, That moment was all Sarah needed. She moved with the speed and grace of someone who had performed this dance 1,000 times before, sliding in beside the mare's neck and finding the jugular vein with practiced ease. The needle slipped in smoothly, and within seconds, the sedative began its work. The mare's thrashing slowed, then stopped altogether as her muscles relaxed and her breathing deepened. The foal, sensing that something had changed, let out a high-pitched whinny of distress and rushed to its mother's side, nuzzling her face with frantic urgency. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the young creature try to wake its mother, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the sedative began to wear off, and they needed to use every second wisely. Sarah examined the trap first, her gloved hands probing carefully around the rusted metal jaws. The device was old but still brutally effective, and it had clamped down on the mare's leg with enough force to damage the soft tissue and possibly fracture one of the smaller bones in the pastern area. Removing it would require specialized tools, which fortunately Sarah had brought in anticipation of exactly this kind of situation. She retrieved a pair of heavy-duty trap spreaders from her van and positioned them carefully on either side of the jaws. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air as Sarah worked the spreaders, slowly forcing the trap open millimeter by millimeter. Clara held the mare's head steady, stroking her face and continuing to murmur words of comfort, even though the animal was unconscious and could not hear them. The foal had stopped its frantic nuzzling and now stood perfectly still, watching the humans work with an expression that seemed almost like understanding. Its large brown eyes moved from face to face, as if memorizing each person who was helping its mother. After what felt like an eternity but was actually only about 4 minutes, the trap finally released its grip. Sarah carefully lifted the rusted jaws away from the mare's leg, revealing the full extent of the damage beneath. The wound was deep and ugly, a ragged tear through skin and muscle that would require extensive cleaning and stitching to repair properly. But the leg was not broken, which Sarah announced with visible relief, and with proper care the mare would likely regain full use of the limb over time. But the trap wound was the lesser of their concerns. Sarah now turned her attention to the swelling on the mare's head, and what she found made her blood run cold. The bulge was soft and fluctuant, indicating that fluid had accumulated beneath the skin, and when she gently palpated the area, she could feel the skull beneath shifting slightly in a way that suggested a fracture. This mare had suffered a severe blow to the head at some point, possibly from a kick or a fall, and the resulting hemorrhage had been building pressure inside her cranium ever since. Sarah explained to Clara that they were dealing with what appeared to be an epidural hematoma, a collection of blood between the skull and the outer membrane covering the brain. In horses, this condition was relatively rare but extremely dangerous, and without surgical intervention to relieve the pressure, the mare would almost certainly die within the next 24 to 48 hours. The nearest equine surgical facility was nearly 3 hours away, and Sarah was not certain the mare would survive the journey in her current condition. Clara looked at the unconscious mare, then at the foal who had not moved from its mother's side, and made a decision that would define everything that followed. She told Sarah to do whatever was necessary, right here, right now, regardless of the risks or the odds. This mare had fought too hard to survive, and her foal had shown too much courage to be abandoned in their hour of greatest need. If there was even the smallest chance of saving her, Clara was willing to take it. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding her agreement. She had performed field surgeries before under difficult circumstances, though never anything quite this complex. But she had also learned long ago that sometimes the textbook answer was not the right answer, and that courage sometimes meant attempting the impossible when all other options had been exhausted. She began preparing her surgical kit while Diego brought additional supplies from the van, and the foal watched everything with those knowing eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond its tender age. What happened next would push everyone to their breaking point and reveal the true depths of the bond between a mother and her child. The makeshift operating theater that Sarah established in that overgrown field would have made any traditional surgeon cringe with horror. The ground was uneven and covered with grass and debris. The lighting came solely from the morning sun filtering through scattered clouds, and the patient was a 1,000-pound animal whose vital signs were being monitored with portable equipment that had never been designed for such a critical procedure. But Sarah had long ago learned that veterinary medicine in rural areas required improvisation, and she approached the task with the focused determination of someone who understood that perfection was the enemy of progress when a life hung in the balance. Diego had spread a large sterile drape beneath the mare's head, creating as clean a workspace as possible under the circumstances. Clara continued to monitor the animal's breathing and heart rate, calling out numbers to Sarah every 30 seconds so the veterinarian could track any changes that might indicate distress. The foal had been gently moved a few feet away by Marcus, who had finally managed to earn a small measure of its trust by offering handfuls of sweet grain and speaking in low, soothing tones. But the young creature refused to take its eyes off its mother, watching the proceedings with an intensity that made everyone present feel as though they were being judged by a silent witness. Sarah began by carefully shaving the area around the swelling, using battery-powered clippers that hummed softly in the morning air. The mare's chestnut coat fell away in clumps, revealing the pale skin beneath and making the extent of the injury even more apparent. The bulge was approximately the size of a grapefruit, and its surface was taut with the pressure of the blood that had accumulated beneath. Sarah could see faint bruising spreading outward from the center, a dark purple stain that spoke of the violence this animal had endured at some point in her recent past. The veterinarian administered a local anesthetic around the surgical site, even though the mare was already sedated, to ensure that no pain signals would reach her brain and potentially trigger a dangerous reaction. Then, with hands that remained steady, despite the enormity of what she was about to attempt, Sarah made her first incision. The scalpel sliced through skin and subcutaneous tissue with practiced precision, and almost immediately, dark blood began to well up from the wound. This was the hematoma releasing its contents, and Sarah worked quickly to control the flow, while simultaneously creating an opening large enough to properly drain the accumulated fluid. What she found beneath the surface made her pause for just a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The skull itself bore a visible crack, a jagged line that ran diagonally across the frontal bone and extended toward the orbit of the left eye. This was not a minor injury caused by a simple bump or fall. Someone had struck this mare with tremendous force, likely with a blunt object, and the fact that she had survived long enough to be found was nothing short of miraculous. The hemorrhage had been building for what Sarah estimated was at least 3 or 4 days, slowly compressing the brain tissue beneath and causing the neurological symptoms that had made the mare so disoriented and vulnerable. Clara listened to Sarah's explanation with growing horror, her mind racing to comprehend the cruelty that could lead someone to inflict such damage on an innocent animal. The mare had clearly been abused, beaten, and then abandoned to die in this remote location where no one would ever find her. But someone had not counted on the foal, whose presence had kept the mare fighting to survive when every fiber of her being must have wanted to surrender to the darkness. A mother's love had kept her alive long enough for help to arrive, and now that love would be tested in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Sarah continued working with meticulous care, evacuating the clotted blood and irrigating the wound with sterile saline to ensure that no debris remained. The pressure inside the mare's skull was visibly decreasing, and with it came subtle signs of improvement in her vital signs. Her breathing became slightly deeper and more regular, and the tension in her muscles began to ease in a way that suggested the pain was finally diminishing. Clara felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time since arriving at the scene, a fragile flower that she was almost afraid to nurture for fear that it would be crushed. The foal, meanwhile, had grown increasingly restless as the procedure continued. It paced back and forth at the edge of the area Marcus had designated as safe, its small hooves stamping the ground with impatience and worry. Several times it attempted to break free and rush to its mother's side, only to be gently redirected by Marcus, who had developed a surprising rapport with the young animal over the past hour. But there was something in the foal's behavior that struck Clara as unusual, a purposefulness that seemed to go beyond simple maternal anxiety. As Sarah began closing the surgical site with careful sutures, the foal suddenly stopped its pacing and stood perfectly still. Its ears rotated forward, and its nostrils flared wide as if catching a scent that no one else could detect. Then, without any warning, it let out a piercing whinny that echoed across the field and made everyone freeze in their tracks. The sound was not one of fear or distress, but something else entirely, something that Clara could only describe as a call, as if the foal were summoning something or someone from the depths of the surrounding forest. For a long moment, nothing happened. The humans exchanged confused glances, uncertain what to make of the foal's strange behavior. Then, from the tree line about 100 yards away, a figure emerged. It was a man, elderly and weathered, walking with a pronounced limp and carrying a wooden staff that he used to steady himself on the uneven ground. He moved slowly but with clear purpose, his eyes fixed on the scene before him, and as he drew closer, Clara could see that his face was streaked with tears. The old man stopped about 20 feet away and looked at the mare lying on the ground, then at the foal who had called him forth, and finally at Clara and her team of rescuers. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, cracked with emotion and heavy with a grief that seemed to span years rather than days. He said simply that his name was Samuel, and that these horses belonged to him. The revelation hung in the air like morning mist, heavy and suffocating. Clara felt her initial compassion harden into something sharper as she looked at the old man who claimed ownership of these suffering animals. Her voice carried an edge when she spoke, demanding to know how he could have allowed this to happen, how any person could stand by while a horse lay trapped and dying with a head wound that spoke of deliberate violence. The accusation was clear in her tone, and she made no effort to soften it, for she had seen too many cases of neglect and abuse to extend the benefit of the doubt to anyone who appeared at a scene like this. Samuel did not flinch at her words or attempt to defend himself with excuses. Instead, he lowered himself slowly to his knees in the grass, his old joints protesting the movement, and he began to weep with the broken sobs of a man who had lost everything. The story that emerged over the next several minutes was one of tragedy and helplessness, of love tested by circumstances beyond anyone's control, and by the time he finished speaking, Clara found herself fighting back tears of her own. Samuel explained that he had owned a small farm about 5 miles to the north, a modest property where he had raised horses for nearly 4 decades. The mare lying before them was named Rosie, and she had been born on his land 8 years ago, the daughter of his favorite broodmare who had passed away shortly after giving birth. Samuel had raised Rosie by hand, bottle-feeding her through those first critical weeks, and forming a bond that only those who have nursed an orphaned animal can truly understand. She had grown into a magnificent horse, gentle and intelligent, with a spirit that seemed to understand human emotions in ways that defied explanation. 3 months ago, Rosie had given birth to her first foal, a strong little filly that Samuel had named Hope because her arrival had come during the darkest period of his life. His wife of 47 years had been diagnosed with terminal cancer just weeks before, and the birth of the foal had been a small light in an ocean of despair. Samuel had spent every moment he could spare with Rosie and Hope, finding solace in their presence when the weight of his grief threatened to crush him entirely. But 2 weeks ago, everything had fallen apart. His wife had passed away in the night, and Samuel had collapsed from the strain, suffering a mild stroke that had left him partially paralyzed and confined to the county hospital. He had begged the doctors to let him go home, to let him care for his animals, but they had insisted that he needed observation and rehabilitation. He had called everyone he could think of, desperate to find someone who could look after Rosie and Hope in his absence. But his family was scattered across the country, and his neighbors had their own struggles to contend with. In desperation, Samuel had contacted a man named Vincent Harlow, someone who had approached him months earlier about buying his property and horses. Vincent had seemed pleasant enough at the time, offering what appeared to be a fair price for the land, but Samuel had refused because he could not imagine parting with the animals who had become his family. When Samuel called from the hospital, Vincent had agreed to check on the horses until Samuel could return home, presenting himself as a good Samaritan willing to help a neighbor in need. What Samuel did not know until much later was that Vincent Harlow was not a kind man at all. He was a developer who wanted Samuel's land for a commercial project, and he had grown impatient waiting for the old farmer to sell willingly. When Vincent arrived at the farm and found the horses, he saw an opportunity to accelerate his plans. If the animals were gone and Samuel had nothing left to return to, perhaps he would finally agree to sell. Vincent had tried to load Rosie and Hope into a trailer to transport them to an auction house 2 counties away, but Rosie had fought back with every ounce of strength in her body. She had reared and kicked, refusing to be separated from her home, and in his fury at being defied by a mere animal, Vincent had struck her across the head with a metal pipe. The blow had been savage and cruel, delivered with the full force of his rage, and Rosie had collapsed in the barn. Believing he had killed her, Vincent had panicked and fled, leaving the injured mare and her terrified foal behind. But Rosie had not died. She had risen again hours later, driven by an instinct that transcended her own pain and fear. Her foal needed her, and she would not abandon Hope no matter what had been done to her body. Together, mother and daughter had escaped through a broken fence and wandered for days through the forest, Rosie growing weaker with each passing hour as the hemorrhage in her brain continued to expand. They had been heading south, toward the only other place Rosie knew, the creek where Samuel used to take her on summer afternoons to cool off and graze on the sweet grass that grew along the banks. It was there, near that creek, that Rosie had stumbled into the trap. The device had been set illegally by poachers hunting for deer, and Rosie's weakened state had made it impossible for her to avoid or escape its iron jaws. She had collapsed in the grass, unable to go any further, and Hope had stood guard over her mother for what must have been at least a day and a night before Marcus had discovered them. Samuel had learned all of this just hours ago, when the hospital staff finally told him that his farm had been found abandoned and his horses were missing. He had discharged himself against medical advice, borrowed a car from a fellow patient, and driven to his property to search for Rosie and Hope. When the foal's cry had echoed through the forest, he had known immediately that his horses were calling him, guiding him to where they had fallen. Now he knelt in the grass beside his beloved Rosie, his trembling hand reaching out to touch her face, while tears carved rivers through the dust on his weathered cheeks. Clara watched him with a heart that ached with shared sorrow. All her earlier anger dissolved into compassion for this broken old man who had lost everything and everyone except these 2 precious souls. Sarah finished the final suture and stepped back to assess her work, her surgical gloves stained with blood and her forehead damp with perspiration despite the cool morning air. The procedure had been as successful as she could have hoped given the circumstances, but she warned everyone present that the next 48 hours would be critical. Brain injuries in horses were unpredictable at the best of times, and Rosie had endured not only the initial trauma but also days of wandering through the forest with a fractured skull and expanding hematoma. The fact that she had survived this long was remarkable, but survival and recovery were 2 very different things. Clara helped Samuel rise from his knees, supporting his frail body as he struggled to stand on legs weakened by his recent stroke. The old man's eyes never left Rosie's face, and his lips moved constantly in what Clara realized was a silent prayer, a desperate plea to whatever powers might be listening to spare this creature who meant more to him than his own life. Hope had finally been allowed to approach her mother, and the foal immediately pressed herself against Rosie's side, her small body trembling with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The decision was made to transport Rosie to Clara's sanctuary, where proper facilities existed for her ongoing care and recovery. Sarah would accompany them and remain on site for at least the first few days to monitor Rosie's condition and intervene immediately if complications arose. Samuel insisted on coming as well, refusing to be separated from his horses despite his obvious physical limitations, and Clara did not have the heart to deny him. She could see that being with Rosie and Hope was the only medicine that might heal the wounds in this old man's soul. The process of loading Rosie into the trailer was delicate and nerve-wracking. She remained sedated, but was beginning to show signs of returning consciousness, her eyelids fluttering and her limbs twitching occasionally as the drugs wore off. Diego had backed the trailer as close to the mare as possible, and together with Marcus and 2 other neighbors who had arrived to help, they used a specialized sling to lift her carefully onto the padded floor. Hope followed without any encouragement, leaping into the trailer with the agility that belied her young age and immediately positioning herself beside her mother. The drive back to Willow Creek Farm took nearly an hour, and Clara spent every minute of it watching Rosie through the small window that connected the truck cab to the trailer. The mare remained stable throughout the journey, her breathing steady and her vital signs holding within acceptable ranges. Hope never moved from her position, standing guard over her mother with the same fierce determination she had displayed in the field. Clara found herself marveling at the depth of the bond between these 2 animals, a connection that seemed to transcend the ordinary relationship between mother and offspring. When they finally arrived at the sanctuary, Clara's staff was already prepared for their new arrivals. Word had spread quickly through the local network of animal rescue volunteers, and 6 people had gathered to help with whatever was needed. A large stall in the main barn had been prepared with extra bedding, heat lamps to keep Rosie warm, and all the monitoring equipment that Sarah had requested. The veterinarian supervised the transfer from trailer to stall with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that Rosie was positioned comfortably and that all her vital signs remained stable. Samuel was given a chair in the corner of the stall, and he settled into it with a sigh of exhaustion that spoke of both physical and emotional depletion. His eyes continued to track every movement, every breath, every twitch of Rosie's ears, as if his vigilance alone could keep her anchored to the world of the living. Hope had initially resisted being separated from her mother even by a few feet, but eventually she allowed Clara to coax her toward a bucket of warm milk replacement formula, her hunger finally overcoming her anxiety. As the afternoon wore on, Rosie began to show more signs of consciousness. Her eyes opened for longer periods, though they remained unfocused and confused, and she made several attempts to lift her head before exhaustion forced her back down. Sarah monitored these developments carefully, explaining to Clara and Samuel that the brain would need time to recover from the trauma and that gradual improvement was actually a positive sign. Too rapid a return to full consciousness could indicate dangerous swelling or other complications. The moment that would change everything came just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the interior of the barn in shades of gold and amber. Rosie had been still for nearly an hour, her breathing deep and regular in what appeared to be natural sleep rather than sedation. Hope had finished her meal and returned to her mother's side, lying down in the straw with her small body pressed against Rosie's barrel. Samuel had dozed off in his chair, his chin resting on his chest and his weathered hands folded in his lap. Clara was just about to step out to check on the other animals when she noticed something that made her freeze in place. Hope had risen to her feet and was behaving strangely, circling her mother with quick, agitated steps and letting out soft whickers that seemed almost like words. The foal's behavior was urgent, insistent, as if she were trying to communicate something important to anyone who would listen. Then Hope did something that Clara had never seen a foal do in all her years of working with horses. The young filly positioned herself directly in front of her mother's face and began to nudge Rosie's muzzle repeatedly, not with the gentle nuzzling of affection, but with forceful, deliberate pushes that seemed designed to provoke a response. When Rosie did not react, Hope stepped back and let out a cry that echoed through the barn, a sound so filled with anguish and desperation that it woke Samuel from his sleep and brought Sarah running from the adjacent room. Something was terribly wrong. Rosie's breathing had changed, becoming shallow and irregular, and her body had gone completely still in a way that felt different from sleep. Sarah rushed to the mare's side and began checking vital signs, her face growing increasingly grave with each passing second. The brain hemorrhage had not been fully resolved after all, and a secondary bleed was now threatening to take Rosie's life. Hope's instincts had detected the crisis before any human could have noticed, and her warning had given them a chance to act. Sarah's hands moved with desperate speed as she assessed the situation, her training taking over even as her heart raced with fear. Rosie's pupils had become unequal in size, a classic sign of increasing intracranial pressure, and her breathing had deteriorated into an irregular pattern that indicated her brainstem was being compressed. The secondary hemorrhage that Sarah had feared but hoped would not materialize was now actively threatening to end Rosie's life, and they had only minutes to act before the damage became irreversible. The veterinarian shouted instructions to Clara and Diego, calling for emergency medications and equipment that she had fortunately brought with her in anticipation of exactly this kind of crisis. Within seconds, she was administering a bolus of hypertonic saline through the intravenous catheter she had placed earlier, hoping to draw fluid away from the swollen brain tissue and reduce the pressure that was slowly crushing Rosie's consciousness. She followed this with mannitol, another osmotic agent that could help pull excess fluid from the cranial vault, and a dose of corticosteroids to combat the inflammatory cascade that was contributing to the swelling. Samuel had risen from his chair and stood trembling at the edge of the stall, his face ashen with terror as he watched the scene unfold before him. His lips moved in continuous prayer, the words tumbling out in a stream of desperate faith that reached toward heaven with the urgency of a dying man's final plea. He had already lost his wife, already lost his health, and now he was watching the last light in his life flicker on the edge of extinction. The cruelty of it was almost too much to bear. But it was Hope who commanded everyone's attention in those terrible minutes. The foal had not retreated when the humans rushed in to help her mother. Instead, she had positioned herself at Rosie's head, her small muzzle pressed against her mother's cheek, and she was making sounds that none of them had ever heard before. They were not the typical vocalizations of a frightened young horse. They were something else entirely, a series of low, rhythmic murmurs that seemed almost like humming, rising and falling in patterns that felt deliberate and purposeful. Clara watched in amazement as Hope continued her strange behavior, and she noticed something remarkable happening in response. Rosie's breathing, which had been growing increasingly erratic, began to stabilize. The mare's chest rose and fell in time with Hope's vocalizations, as if the foal were somehow guiding her mother's respiration through the crisis. Sarah noticed the change too and paused in her ministrations, her scientific mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes were witnessing. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as everyone waited to see whether the medications would take effect and whether whatever magic Hope was working would be enough to pull Rosie back from the brink. Sarah continued to monitor vital signs, calling out numbers that gradually began to improve. The inequality in Rosie's pupils slowly resolved, returning to normal size and reactivity. Her breathing deepened and regularized, no longer carrying the ominous irregularity that had signaled impending disaster. Her heart rate, which had climbed dangerously high, began to descend toward normal ranges. After what felt like hours but was actually only about 20 minutes, Sarah sat back on her heels and let out a long, shaking breath. The crisis had passed, at least for now. Rosie was stable again, and while she was not out of danger, she had survived a complication that should have killed her. Sarah looked at Hope, who had finally stopped her strange humming and was now lying quietly beside her mother, and she shook her head in wonder. In all her years of veterinary medicine, she had never witnessed anything quite like what had just occurred. Clara helped Samuel back into his chair, the old man's legs having given out beneath him when the tension finally broke. Tears streamed freely down his face, but for the first time since his arrival, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched Hope's head, stroking the soft fur between her ears with a gentleness that spoke of profound gratitude. The foal accepted his touch without flinching, her eyes half closed in exhaustion from the ordeal she had just endured. As the evening deepened into night, Clara found herself sitting outside the stall, watching the three figures within and reflecting on what she had witnessed. She had always believed in the special bonds that could form between animals and between animals and humans, but she had never seen such a dramatic demonstration of that connection. Hope had somehow known that her mother was in danger before any medical instrument could have detected the problem, and she had responded with an intervention that seemed to defy any rational explanation. Sarah joined her after completing another round of checks on Rosie, settling onto an overturned bucket with a tired sigh. The veterinarian admitted that she had no scientific explanation for what Hope had done, but she also acknowledged that science did not have answers for everything. There were mysteries in the natural world that remained beyond human understanding, and perhaps the bond between a mother and her child was one of them. Whatever had happened, Hope had saved Rosie's life, and that was the only fact that truly mattered. The night passed slowly, with Clara and Sarah taking turns monitoring Rosie while Samuel dozed fitfully in his chair. Hope never left her mother's side, sleeping pressed against Rosie's warm body and waking instantly whenever the mare stirred or made any sound. By morning, Rosie was showing genuine signs of improvement. Her eyes were clearer and more focused, and she was able to lift her head and look around the stall with what appeared to be recognition and curiosity. When Rosie's gaze found Samuel, something passed between them that made Clara's heart swell with emotion. The mare let out a soft nicker, a sound of greeting and affection that she must have made 1,000 times over the years they had spent together. Samuel rose from his chair and crossed to her side, kneeling in the straw despite the pain in his weakened body, and he wrapped his arms around her neck while sobs of joy shook his frail frame. Hope watched this reunion with an expression that seemed almost like satisfaction, as if she understood that her work was finally bearing fruit. But the foal's greatest act was yet to come, and what she would do next would leave everyone who witnessed it utterly speechless. The days that followed Rosie's crisis were filled with cautious optimism and the slow, steady work of healing. Sarah remained at the sanctuary for the first week, monitoring the mare's neurological function and adjusting medications as needed. The surgical site on Rosie's head was healing cleanly, with no signs of infection or complications, and the swelling had diminished significantly. Each morning brought new improvements, small victories that accumulated into a picture of genuine recovery. Rosie was eating on her own, drinking water regularly, and even attempting to stand with assistance from the sling system that Clara had rigged in the stall. Samuel had essentially moved into the barn, refusing all suggestions that he return to his own home or seek additional medical care for himself. Clara had set up a small cot in the adjacent tack room, and the old man slept there every night, waking at the slightest sound from Rosie's stall. His own health was precarious, the effects of his stroke still evident in the weakness on his left side and the slight slur that occasionally crept into his speech, but he seemed to draw strength from being near his horses. The color had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes, which had been dull with grief when he first arrived, now sparkled with renewed purpose. Hope continued to astonish everyone with her behavior. The foal had developed a routine that seemed designed to aid her mother's recovery, spending hours each day standing beside Rosie and grooming her coat with gentle nibbles. She would walk slow circles around the stall, as if demonstrating to her mother how movement was possible and encouraging her to try the same. When Rosie finally managed to stand on her own for the first time, Hope had positioned herself strategically, allowing the mare to lean against her small body for support. The sight of this young creature literally propping up her injured mother had brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. But there was another matter that demanded attention, one that Clara had not forgotten despite the chaos of the rescue and recovery. Vincent Harlow remained free, having faced no consequences for the brutal attack that had nearly killed Rosie and could have left Hope orphaned in the wilderness. Clara had reported the incident to the local sheriff immediately after learning the truth from Samuel, and an investigation had been opened. However, progress was frustratingly slow, and Vincent had apparently hired an expensive lawyer who was doing everything possible to delay and obstruct the process. Clara spent several evenings researching Vincent Harlow's background and discovered a pattern of behavior that made her blood boil. He had been involved in numerous disputes with property owners over the years, using various pressure tactics to force reluctant sellers to accept his offers. Several former neighbors had filed complaints about harassment and intimidation, though none of the cases had resulted in criminal charges. Vincent was careful, covering his tracks and maintaining a veneer of respectability that fooled those who did not look too closely. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, delivered by an unlikely messenger. A young woman named Jessica arrived at the sanctuary one afternoon, identifying herself as Vincent Harlow's former assistant. She had worked for him for nearly 2 years before quitting in disgust 3 months earlier, and she had been following the news about the rescued horses with growing guilt. Jessica had witnessed Vincent's true nature firsthand, had seen him lose his temper and destroy property in fits of rage, and she had suspected for a long time that he was capable of violence against animals as well as people. What Jessica brought with her changed everything. She had copies of emails and text messages that documented Vincent's plan to acquire Samuel's property by any means necessary. There were communications with a business partner discussing how to pressure the old farmer into selling, including references to making problems for his animals that would force his hand. Most damning of all was a text message sent on the night of the attack, in which Vincent had written that he had handled the horse problem and that the old man would have nothing left to come home to. Clara immediately contacted the sheriff with this new evidence, and within 48 hours, Vincent Harlow was arrested and charged with felony animal cruelty, trespassing, and attempted theft. The news spread quickly through the community, and suddenly people who had been afraid to speak out against the wealthy developer began coming forward with their own stories. A local television station picked up the case, and soon Vincent's face was appearing on screens across the county, his carefully constructed reputation crumbling in real time. Samuel watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. He was glad that justice was being served, but the ordeal had cost him more than anyone could calculate. His wife was gone, his health was broken, and his beloved farm had been violated by a man whose greed knew no bounds. Even if Vincent spent years in prison, it would not bring back what Samuel had lost or erase the suffering that Rosie had endured. Some wounds, he knew, could never fully heal. But then something happened that reminded Samuel why life was still worth living, why hope was not just the name of a foal, but a force that could sustain the human spirit through even the darkest nights. It began on a quiet morning about 3 weeks after the rescue, when Rosie was finally strong enough to venture outside the barn for the first time. Clara and Diego helped guide the mare through the door and into the small paddock that had been prepared for her, while Hope trotted alongside with barely contained excitement. The sun was warm on Rosie's back as she stepped onto the grass, and she paused to lift her head and breathe deeply of the fresh air. Samuel watched from his wheelchair, which Clara had finally convinced him to use to preserve his remaining strength, and tears of joy streamed down his face. But it was Hope who stole the show, dancing circles around her mother with a playful energy that seemed to celebrate the miracle of this moment. Then the foal did something that made everyone gasp. She ran to the far end of the paddock, turned to face her mother, and began to prance forward with an exaggerated high-stepping gait that was unmistakably intentional. She was showing off, performing for an audience of humans and one very special mare, and the message was clear. Hope was telling her mother that it was time to dance again. Rosie stood motionless for a long moment, watching her daughter's playful display with eyes that had regained much of their former brightness. The mare's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, defying the grim predictions that even Sarah had privately harbored in those first terrible days. The wound on her head had closed completely, leaving only a small scar hidden beneath her growing coat, and her neurological function had returned to near normal levels. She still tired more easily than before, and occasionally she would pause mid-stride, as if momentarily confused, but these episodes were becoming less frequent with each passing week. Now, seeing Hope prance and dance at the far end of the paddock, something stirred within Rosie that had been dormant since before the attack. It was the spark of joy, the simple pleasure of being alive and healthy and surrounded by those who loved her. The mare took one tentative step forward, then another, and then she was walking toward her daughter with a steadiness that made Clara's heart soar. When mother and daughter met in the middle of the paddock, they touched noses in a gesture of affection that seemed to contain entire volumes of unspoken communication. What happened next would be talked about in the community for years to come. Hope suddenly wheeled away from her mother and broke into a canter, her small legs churning through the grass with surprising speed. She ran to the fence, spun around, and came galloping back toward Rosie, only to veer away at the last moment and circle around behind her. It was an invitation, a challenge, a plea for her mother to join in the game. And incredibly, impossibly, Rosie accepted. The mare began to move slowly at first, her legs finding their rhythm after weeks of enforced stillness. She walked, then trotted, and then, to the amazement of everyone watching, she broke into a gentle canter that carried her across the paddock in pursuit of her daughter. Hope squealed with delight and ran faster, weaving between the fence posts and doubling back to brush against her mother's side. For several glorious minutes, mother and daughter ran together, their movements synchronized in a dance of pure joy that transcended the boundaries of species and spoke to something universal in the nature of love. Samuel watched from his wheelchair, with tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. He had seen Rosie run 1,000 times before, had watched her gallop across his pastures with the wind in her mane and the sun on her back. But he had never seen anything quite like this. There was something different about the way she moved now, something that spoke of gratitude and appreciation for abilities that she had come so close to losing forever. Every stride seemed to celebrate the miracle of survival, the triumph of will over circumstance, the power of a bond that even death could not sever. Clara stood beside Samuel, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as they shared this moment of profound beauty. She had witnessed many recoveries over the years, had seen horses come back from injuries that should have ended their lives, but this case was special in ways she could not fully articulate. It was not just the physical healing that moved her, impressive as that was. It was the relationship between Rosie and Hope, the way they seemed to draw strength from each other, the way the foal had refused to give up on her mother, even when all hope seemed lost. When the horses finally slowed and returned to a peaceful walk, grazing side by side in the afternoon sunshine, Clara began to consider the future. Samuel's health was improving, but he was clearly not capable of caring for 2 horses on his own, especially given the ongoing maintenance that Rosie would require. His farm remained standing, but Vincent's vandalism had left it in disrepair, and the legal proceedings surrounding the case would take months to resolve. The question of where Rosie and Hope would ultimately live weighed heavily on Clara's mind. She broached the subject gently with Samuel that evening as they sat together on the porch of the farmhouse watching the sun set over the sanctuary. The old man listened quietly, his gaze distant, and when she finished speaking, he remained silent for a long time. Finally, he turned to face her with an expression that held both sorrow and peace in equal measure. Samuel admitted that he had been thinking about the same thing. He knew that he could not provide for Rosie and Hope the way they deserved, not anymore. His body was failing, his farm was damaged, and the life he had built with his wife had ended with her passing. But he could not bear the thought of being separated from these horses who had become his entire world. They had kept him alive during the darkest days of his grief, had given him a reason to keep fighting when surrender would have been so much easier. Clara had anticipated this struggle and had spent considerable time developing a solution that might address everyone's needs. She proposed that Samuel move permanently to the sanctuary, taking up residence in a small cottage on the property that had once housed a former caretaker. He would be near Rosie and Hope every day, able to participate in their care to whatever extent his health allowed, while Clara and her staff handled the heavier responsibilities. In return, Samuel could contribute his decades of knowledge about horses, mentoring younger volunteers and sharing the wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime in their company. The old man's eyes widened as he listened, and Clara could see hope kindling behind the grief that had shadowed his features for so long. He asked if she truly meant it, if she would really welcome a broken-down old farmer into her home and allow him to spend his remaining days with the horses he loved. Clara assured him that the offer was sincere and that having someone of his experience on the property would be an invaluable gift to the entire operation. Samuel reached out and took Clara's hand in both of his own, his grip surprisingly strong despite the weakness that plagued his left side. He accepted her offer with a gratitude that went beyond words, and in that moment, a new chapter began for everyone involved. But neither of them knew that the greatest surprise was still waiting, a revelation that would come from the most unexpected source and leave them questioning everything they thought they understood about the bonds between living creatures. Hope had one more miracle to perform. The transition happened more smoothly than anyone had dared to hope. Within 2 weeks, Samuel had settled into the small cottage on Clara's property, his meager belongings arranged in a space that quickly began to feel like home. The cottage overlooked the main pasture where Rosie and Hope spent their days, and Samuel would sit by the window for hours, watching them graze and play and simply exist in the peaceful rhythm of sanctuary life. His health continued to improve, perhaps because for the first time since his wife's death he had something to live for beyond mere survival. Rosie's recovery progressed steadily, and by the end of the 2nd month, Sarah officially declared her neurologically sound. There would always be a slight weakness on her left side, a subtle remnant of the brain injury that only trained eyes could detect, but it did not impair her quality of life or her ability to move freely. The leg that had been caught in the trap had healed beautifully as well, the scar tissue softening over time until only a faint line marked where the metal jaws had torn through flesh and muscle. She was, against all odds, whole again. Hope had grown considerably during their time at the sanctuary, her gangly foal proportions beginning to fill out into the graceful lines of a young horse. At 5 months old, she had lost none of the fierce protective instinct that had marked her from the beginning, still positioning herself between her mother and any perceived threat, still watching over Rosie with eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her years. But she had also developed a playful, curious nature that delighted everyone who spent time with her, investigating every corner of her environment and making friends with the other horses in Clara's care. It was during this period of relative calm that strange things began to happen, incidents that none of the staff could explain using any framework of ordinary understanding. The first occurrence took place late one evening when Diego was making his final rounds of the barn. He found Hope standing at the door of a stall housing an elderly gelding named Chester, who had been declining slowly for weeks due to kidney failure. The foal was making those same low, rhythmic sounds that she had produced during Rosie's crisis, her muzzle pressed against the bars as if trying to reach the old horse inside. Diego watched for several minutes, unsure what to make of the scene, before finally convincing Hope to return to her own stall for the night. The next morning, Chester showed marked improvement, eating his breakfast with an appetite he had not displayed in weeks and moving with less stiffness than had become his norm. Sarah examined him and found that his kidney values, while still abnormal, had stabilized in a way that defied the expected progression of his disease. She could offer no medical explanation for the change. Similar incidents followed over the coming weeks. A mare recovering from colic surgery began improving rapidly after Hope spent an afternoon standing beside her stall. A young horse who had developed a severe respiratory infection bounced back faster than anyone anticipated following an unexplained visit from the foal in the middle of the night. Each time, Hope seemed to know which animal needed her attention, seeking them out without any guidance from the humans around her, and performing her strange ritual of humming and physical contact. Clara documented these occurrences carefully, keeping detailed notes on dates, times, and outcomes. She was not by nature a superstitious person, having spent too many years in the practical world of animal rescue to indulge in mystical thinking. But she could not deny what she was witnessing, could not explain away the pattern that was emerging before her eyes. Hope possessed some kind of gift, an ability to sense illness or injury and to facilitate healing through means that science could not measure or explain. Word began to spread through the network of rescue organizations and veterinary professionals who knew Clara's work. At first, the stories were met with skepticism, dismissed as exaggeration or wishful thinking by people too emotionally invested in their animals to think clearly. But when Sarah began sharing her own observations, lending her professional credibility to the accounts, attitudes began to shift. Veterinarians from neighboring counties started visiting the sanctuary, hoping to witness Hope's abilities firsthand, and more often than not, they left as believers. Samuel watched all of this unfold with a quiet smile that suggested he was not at all surprised. When Clara finally asked him directly whether he had known about Hope's gift, the old man nodded slowly, his eyes taking on a distant quality, as if gazing into memories from long ago. He explained that he had sensed something special about Hope from the moment she was born, something that went beyond the ordinary bond between a man and his horses. She had come into the world during his darkest hour, arrived like a beacon of light in an ocean of grief, and he had always believed that her purpose was greater than anyone could imagine. But what happened next elevated Hope from a local curiosity to something approaching legend. It occurred on a gray November morning when the first hints of winter were beginning to touch the Kentucky hills. A truck pulled into the sanctuary's driveway, and from it emerged a family Clara had never met, a young couple with a daughter of perhaps 7 years who sat slumped in a wheelchair, her eyes vacant and her body motionless. The father explained that they had driven 6 hours after hearing about the miraculous foal, desperate for any help with their daughter, who had been in a coma-like state for 3 months following a car accident. Clara's first instinct was to refuse, to explain that Hope was just a horse and that whatever healing she might provide for animals could not possibly extend to humans. But something in the parents' faces stopped her, a grief so profound and a hope so desperate that she found herself unable to turn them away. She looked toward the pasture where Hope grazed beside her mother, and as if sensing Clara's gaze, the foal lifted her head and began walking toward the fence. What happened when Hope approached that little girl would change everything that Clara thought she knew about the nature of healing and the boundaries between species. It would challenge science, inspire faith, and prove that sometimes The most profound miracles come from the most unexpected sources. The family watched with anxious eyes as Hope approached the fence where their daughter sat motionless in her wheelchair. The father had positioned the chair as close as possible, his hands trembling with a mixture of hope and fear that Clara recognized from her own experiences with desperate last chances. The mother stood beside him, tears already streaming down her face, her lips moving in silent prayer. Their daughter, whose name was Emma, showed no reaction to her surroundings, her gaze fixed on some distant point that only she could see. Hope stopped at the fence and stood perfectly still, her large brown eyes studying the little girl with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind rustled through the bare branches of nearby trees, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out its harsh cry. Then Hope lowered her head and stretched her neck through the fence rails, bringing her muzzle within inches of Emma's face. The foal began to make those sounds again, the low rhythmic humming that had accompanied each of her previous healing encounters. But this time there was something different about the tones, something more complex and layered that seemed to resonate in the air itself. Clara felt the vibration in her chest, a warmth that spread outward from her heart and filled her entire body with a sensation she could only describe as peace. She saw the same reaction in the faces of everyone present, a softening of tension and a release of fear that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Minutes passed, though time itself seemed to have lost its meaning in that sacred space between a foal and a child. Hope continued her song, her breath warm against Emma's pale cheek, her presence enveloping the girl like a blanket of pure love. And then, so gradually that at first no one was certain they had seen it, Emma's eyes began to change. The vacant stare that had haunted her features for months started to focus, to sharpen, to recognize the world around her. Emma's mother gasped and clutched her husband's arm, afraid to believe what she was witnessing. The little girl's hand, which had lain limp in her lap since the accident, twitched once, then again, and then slowly rose toward the foal's face. When her small fingers made contact with Hope's soft muzzle, Emma smiled for the first time in 93 days. It was a small smile, tentative and weak, but it was unmistakably real. The sound that escaped the mother's throat was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, but something in between, a release of anguish that had been building for months and could finally find expression. The father fell to his knees beside the wheelchair, his hands shaking as he reached for his daughter's face. Emma turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his with recognition and confusion and love all mixed together in a gaze that said more than words ever could. Clara stepped back to give the family their moment of reunion, her own eyes blurred with tears that she did not bother to wipe away. She felt Samuel's hand slip into hers, the old man having made his way across the property to witness what everyone somehow knew would be extraordinary. Together they watched as Hope withdrew her muzzle from the fence and turned to walk back toward her mother, her task apparently complete. Over the following weeks, Emma's recovery accelerated in ways that baffled her medical team. She regained speech, then movement, then the ability to walk with assistance. Her doctors could find no physiological explanation for the sudden reversal of her condition, no scientific framework that could account for the timing of her emergence from the vegetative state that had imprisoned her. But her parents needed no explanation. They knew what had happened, and they told everyone who would listen about the miracle foal who had brought their daughter back from the brink of permanent darkness. News of Emma's recovery spread far beyond the local community, carried by social media and news outlets hungry for stories of hope in a world that often seemed filled with despair. People began arriving at the sanctuary from across the country, bringing sick animals and sometimes sick humans, all hoping to experience the healing power that hope seemed to possess. Clara was overwhelmed at first, uncertain how to manage the flood of attention while still maintaining the peaceful environment that her rescue animals required. but Samuel, with his quiet wisdom and decades of experience, helped her find a way forward. They established a structured program that allowed limited visits from those seeking Hope's help, while protecting the foal from exploitation and exhaustion. Sarah consulted with researchers from veterinary schools who wanted to study Hope's abilities, finding ways to satisfy scientific curiosity without subjecting the young horse to invasive procedures. And through it all, Rosie watched over her daughter with the same fierce devotion she had displayed since the day she refused to die in that overgrown field. The legal case against Vincent Harlow concluded with a conviction on all charges, resulting in a prison sentence that would keep him behind bars for years. His business empire crumbled as former associates distanced themselves from the scandal, and the property he had so desperately wanted remained in Samuel's name, eventually converted into an extension of Clara's sanctuary. The trap that had nearly ended Rosie's life was recovered and donated to a museum of rural history, a reminder of the cruelty that humans could inflict and the resilience that animals could display. As winter settled fully over the Kentucky hills, Clara stood at the fence of the main pasture watching Rosie and Hope graze together in the fading light. Samuel sat nearby in his wheelchair, wrapped in blankets against the cold, a contented smile on his weathered face. The sanctuary was quiet, the day's visitors departed and the evening chores complete. And in that stillness, Clara felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them all together. Hope lifted her head and looked toward Clara, and in that gaze the woman saw something that transcended ordinary understanding. This foal had been born for a purpose, had come into the world during humanity's darkest hours to remind them that love could heal what seemed beyond repair. She was not just a horse. She was exactly what her name proclaimed, a living embodiment of the force that keeps hearts beating and spirits fighting when all logic says to surrender. Some miracles cannot be explained. They can only be witnessed, honored, and shared with those who still have the capacity to believe. Hope was such a miracle, and her story was only beginning.